around like 15%.
On top of the national mortgage?
Yeah, that's what makes Florida, Wyoming, Tennessee, and Texas rare, because they don't have state income tax. They generate all the revenue from sales tax.
Don't have a vehicle tax either.
At least in the state of Florida, yeah.
That's why we kept our residency in Florida.
Texas and California does. California has everything.
Everybody else will tack on another, if you work in that state, they'll tack on an income tax.
That's really
You'll lose extra money on top of it.
very cool.
Yeah, and then you wonder why they're not. What's really crazy, and I'm going to get causation correlation, but the highest state income taxes states have they're in the bottom 10% of all school districts in the United States. Shocker, what are they spending their money on? So, yeah. Many different arguments on that one.
Maybe 2 more minutes.
What we do have is a 35 cent per gallon gas tax.
So maybe 2 more minutes.
It's still 35 cents a gallon. I'd rather not pay that. I'd rather just not pay taxes.
I think it's $1.20 in
Taxation's
Hey, Anthony.
Why don't I buy gas here?
It's expensive.
Look. Crash my bike, we know I can trust it.
So how many times have you crashed your bike?
Well, we got straight the week before. No, earlier that week. And then twice on the 4 nights.
How many times last time?
I'm counting that time. Probably 1 or 2 at first. Probably 6.
Alright, therefore you're a worst driver.
You do. You. How many times? How much bike do you ride?
I ride for this when I'm at home.
Last one?
You don't do fun things. That's just stupid.
Okay, I think we'll get started. We're at 9:05. Welcome everybody to week 6 of our Exodus journey. If you got a handout, you probably won't need it, because I think they're the week 5 handouts back there. I don't usually make handouts, but if you want to keep it, you're welcome to. If you're new here, I'm Matt. You'll probably see Will Vega come in at some point. He and I have been the ones sort of leading our journey through Exodus, our discussion and everything. This week, we are starting Exodus 19 through 24, and hopefully also finishing it. But if you've been with us, the first week you would have heard a little bit about the book of Exodus, about the people of Israel multiplying. We start every week by reviewing this stuff, that God was faithful to his promise to Abraham, even when his Israelites were in slavery in Egypt. They were multiplying, and so Pharaoh decides to put them into slavery because he's scared that they might revolt and become more powerful even than Egypt. And at the same time, as Pharaoh is burdening them with infanticide and work and slavery, you see God's faithfulness even in preserving the life of one person, Moses, drawing him out of the water, as the name Moses sounds. It sounds like the Hebrew for to draw out. And so from the Nile, where Pharaoh has increased the burdens of Israel by throwing their children into it, from the Nile God will bring redemption. And so then we see as Moses grows up and he is very vocal about the troubles of his people. He ends up being exiled into Midian, and God calls him out of Midian from a burning bush to go and to confront Pharaoh and to give the old "let my people go." And at the same time, God says, it's not going to work. You're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to tell him to do this thing, and he's not going to do it. And it's not until I set him under my heavy hand that he will finally send the Israelites out of slavery and out of Egypt. And so we walk through all of that. We walk through the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, God's great and terrifying power, and God's caring and intense mercy and salvation for the enslaved and the lowly. And again, God's constant mindfulness of the covenant that he had made with Abraham before. In a sense, God won't let his people go. I guess we would rather God not let his people go than Pharaoh not let the people go. We also saw how when the Israelites went through the Red Sea and God used the same water that he used to rescue the Israelites to also judge the Egyptians, he used it to save the lives of the Israelites and to take the lives of the Egyptians. When they made it through, once we read Moses' song, Moses and Miriam, about he is our salvation. He is our strength. Just after singing this song and recognizing this power and this mercy, Will, in our last class, talked about this grumbling that started to happen on the other side. It was almost as if they were expecting to come through the waters, to be let out of slavery, and then all their problems are solved. But that's not what we saw, at least immediately. What we saw was a hungry and wandering and thirsty people. Here's the Vegas. Welcome. So even after witnessing the power and the mercy, still it was very hard to trust God. And you would hear them saying things like, were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? Was it that you just didn't want us to die there, you want us to die here instead? Because that's what seems to be happening. And even in their distrust, even in their grumbling, we saw God who was still powerful and still merciful, who could rain bread from heaven, who could make bitter water safe to drink. Not a God who is vengeful in the sense of how dare you complain to me. We saw a God who was merciful and understanding. Almost like the Psalm says, he remembers that we are dust, to put it powerfully. But today we're going to talk about the law. So they've been wandering through the wilderness, and they come to the face of Mount Sinai, which is where God had called Moses originally. And if you remember, God said, this will be a sign to you that when I free my people from Israel, you will worship me on this mountain. He said, that will be a sign to you. And in these chapters today, that's what we see. We see that what God had promised Moses, he is continuing to fulfill. And so before we get into it, we should pray. So I'll go ahead and pray for us. And then we'll talk about the law. God, we are so grateful to have a place like this where we can come and talk about you without fear. God, I pray that you would use this discussion of your word and your law to empower us as your children into obedience, that you would help us to look to you in faith as a good lawgiver. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So it's important that we talk about the law, because the law is... I actually don't have a handout for this week, so I think those are still left over. Sorry. But it's important that we talk about the law, because the law is pretty confusing, to be honest, especially from where we stand. Sometimes I think about it like ketchup. You have some people who are like, I'm not going to put ketchup on my French fries because that's going to ruin the taste of the French fries, because I want to savor the taste of the French fry. And you have some people who say, well, I'll have some ketchup, but I'll put it on the side and maybe dip some French fries in if I want it. And then you have some people who, this is Sarah. Sarah loves ketchup. But it's almost like she has fries with her ketchup because ketchup is so good. And that is sort of the camps that we have with the law. We have some people who say, I don't like the law. I don't want the law. If I think about the law, it's going to sort of keep me from savoring the sweetness of salvation. And then you have some people who are like, well, the law is important, but maybe we just keep it over here and then we sort of go to it sometimes. And then we have some people who maybe obsessive over the law, where it's almost like with the ketchup and the French fry, like they're having salvation with their law. And so it can be really confusing. What are we, especially on this side of Christ, what do we do with the law? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And to sort of play at this confusion, I have two verses from the New Testament. One of them is Jesus, and he says, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And he goes on to say, whoever relaxes even one of the least of these commandments, or teaches others to do the same, they'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So you have Jesus saying, the law is important. Don't get rid of it. Abide by it. Don't relax one of the least of these commandments. And then in another place, you have Paul who says, I have died to the law so that I might live to God. And of course, we believe that the Bible's not contradictory, so I'll go ahead and say that up front. But when the New Testament talks about these laws in these sort of two different ways of like, it's really important, keep it, and also our relationship to it is really, really different, it can be really hard to say, what do we do with it? And so my goal today is to discuss basically these three questions. And first is, how did God give the law? First. Second, we'll ask, what is the law? What's in it? What's it for? And then finally, we'll use those things leading up to how does the law apply to us today at St. Paul's. And so first, if you'll turn to Exodus 19, we're going to ask this question of, how did God give the law? What is the relationship like between the lawgiver and the law receivers? And so I'm going to read for us Exodus 19, verses 1 to 6, if you want to follow along. Remember, the Israelites have been wandering after being rescued from Egypt. It says, on the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. And Sarah and I actually just learned this weekend, we had an ethics class, and our professor talked about how these 6 verses are a summary of the entire Exodus. You have sort of this pointing forward to a holy nation, a priestly nation, a treasured possession of God. You have God's rescuing from the Egyptians. You have the wandering in the wilderness. And even in these verses, we learn something really significant about the context in which God gives the law. And first, the first important thing that we should note is he gives the law after rescuing them from Egypt. He starts this sort of Sinai experience by saying, did you just see what I just did? How I brought you out of Egypt. Is everybody on the same page? I rescued you from Egypt. And now he's giving them the law. And so, for a discussion question, why does that matter? Why does it matter that God rescued them from Egypt and then gave them the law? What's so significant about that? Yes?
Because he's the one who redeemed, he's the one that sets the conditions by which they have to kind of pay back the debt. And that's kind of, I guess in a business sense, that's kind of how that works. If you go get a loan from a bank, the bank sets the terms of that loan. I don't get to set them. They do, because they have the money, they have the power. And so God is trying to remind them in a greater sense, I have all this power. I did not condemn you like I did the Egyptians. I saved you. You owe me this with your life. And that's, he sets all those conditions for them. If they don't remember that, then they think that maybe they did it themselves. Maybe they were able to turn the salty water to drinkable. But no, he continues to remind them he is the reason why they still exist.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Like, God has just rescued them. And so, who ought they to obey other than the one who has just rescued them? Who is more powerful than God? Who has just even showed them there's no God of the Egyptians who is like me. There's no king who is like me. There's no Pharaoh who is like me. Who else is there to obey but the creator of the universe? Are there any other thoughts? Why would God rescue them and then give them the law?
I think because he redeemed them from an old way of living, now he brought them into a new way of living, so he gives them the guidelines of how to live. Now that you've been delivered, this is how you live. You were in Egypt living a certain way, but from here on forward, how you ought to live.
Nice. Very good. So we might also think about the alternative of like God. Oh, do you got something to say?
Were you going off of that?
I was going off of that.
Okay.
But you can say something. Okay.
I was just going to say, salvation comes before merit, but that's similar.
Yes, similar. So the alternative would be, what if God had heard the cries of the Egyptian, or the Israelites in Egypt? Do you remember that? He said, I've heard the cry of my people. And what if he went to them and said, here's the law, keep it, and then I'll bring you out of Egypt? It's very different than him hearing the cries of his people, him bringing them through the Red Sea, and then saying, here's the law. Very different. And as Sarah said, and as Anthony pointed out, the law doesn't lead to redemption. And it's a really hard thing to think about, that the law doesn't lead to redemption. In a lot of Paul's letters, you see that's the very thing that's like in Galatians that feels like one of his primary purposes, is to say you are not redeemed by the law. And even looking back here at Exodus 19, you see, before God gives the law, he says, you just saw how I rescued you from Egypt. Are we on the same page? I'm not giving you this to be rescued out of slavery. I'm giving you this because you've just been rescued from slavery. Another thing that we see in even just these 6 verses is there's sort of this separation. Do you see that? You see, Moses goes up the mountain and he talks to God. And then he comes down and he talks to the people on God's behalf. And then the people tell him something and he goes up to God and he talks to God and then he comes back down. And even in the Sinai experience, you see Moses going up and down and up and down and up and down. And you sort of start to see this pattern of separation between God and his people. And even at the end of Exodus, you'll see God gives his plans for the tabernacle, where there's this curtain that separates this holy of holies, and a priest can go in on behalf of the people, but you got to be very careful, because God is so holy, so much more holy than this unholy people, that it's almost dangerous for an unholy people to be near a holy God. And so, first we see that the law was given after redemption, and then we see that the law was given by a holy God to an unholy people through a mediator. And a mediator is just someone who sort of comes between. Someone who comes between God and his people. I want to say barrier, sort of barrier between them. That sounds maybe harsher and colder than I want it to sound. But see that Moses is a mediator between God and his people. And you'll also see that in Exodus, God sets up this priestly system of people who will, their whole job is to sort of atone for the sins of the people, to consecrate the people, clean the people, offer sacrifices for the people. It's a people to come between God's people and God so that they might dwell near him at all. And so there's a sort of separation. And so I guess now we'll move on to Exodus 20. And we'll ask the second question. We just saw the sort of context that the law was given in, and now we're going to look at the law itself. When you think about law in general, like when you think about the law in the United States, what do you think about it? What is it for? What is our relationship with the people who set the laws up and who enforce them? What do you think about the law? Do you like it? Do you feel burdened by it? Protected by it? I'm seeing some no's. I don't know what the no is for. Yes.
There are some laws that they're comforting the middle that they're there. There's a higher authority that's ensuring that there's order that's taking place. But there are some nitty-gritty laws that are burdensome.
Yeah. So there's a sense of authority from the lawgiver to the law receiver, and sometimes the laws are so minute and specific and nitty-gritty and some might say arbitrary that it feels like a burden. Even driving to church today, there's speed limit signs. And it's like, who decided the speed limit signs? I didn't. And some people get pulled over for going over them, some people don't. So, I don't know. Any other thoughts? What is it for? Why do they set the law?
It's the writing down of the social contract between each other. That's the kind of the intent of law from its origins, is to take commonly held beliefs, commonly held social norms, and then write them down. Over time, people have realized that there are some merits of safety in some measures, i.e. the speed limit is figured out by some engineers, friction, safety protocols, and what vehicles can withstand in a car accident, in the eventuality of potential harm. So it's just kind of codifying what we, in our sane mind, would deem this is appropriate. These are appropriate behaviors. These things are conducive to a functioning society. And if you look at the Ten Commandments, they as a bigger picture, as what we attempt in modern society to attain, they kind of flow in the same way, because the first one, I'm sure you're going to get to this, but sorry to steal thunder, but
That's okay.
they build upon themselves. So you have the initial law Constitution, and then there's U.S. Code, and then there's state constitutions, and so on. And none can override that highest thing. And that's kind of the way the law works, is it's supposed to be living and breathing in that manner.
Nice. That was a really good answer. I was not expecting that. Why don't we go for it? Why don't we read the law? Why don't we read? We'll read the 10 Commandments. We won't read the whole law. Is like the Genesis to Deuteronomy.
I can't wait to get through Leviticus.
Yes. So I'll read starting in Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So even in this verse, we see first a concern for the previous redemption that has already taken place. He says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And at the same time, we see this mediation, this people who see this holy and, in a sense, terrifying God with the smoke and the thunder and the lightning on top of this mountain. And they say, Moses, you go, but don't let God speak to us lest we die. There is this sort of separation between God and his people. And there have been a lot of different ways to try to understand what the law is. How do we separate it? How do we understand it? How do we divide it into categories? What is it for? And so the first one sort of Jesus gives to us when he says, basically, this is the law. First and foremost, love God above anything else. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. So people call this the 2 tables of the law. First is love God more than you love anything else. Second is love your neighbor. What is an example of one of these commandments which is bent towards loving God? What is one of these commandments that is a command to love God?
The second commandment.
The second one. What is the second one?
You shall not make any images.
Yes, you shall not make any images. And this one can be pretty debated, and even this weekend at our school, it was like, whew. But God has a concern that you will love him more than you love these idols. Or you shouldn't love these idols at all, it's not just more. But God is concerned that you love him and that you love him in the way that he ought to be loved. You can't love him in the same way that the Egyptians loved their gods, through idols and images and child sacrifice and all those sorts of things. God cares to be loved, and he cares to be loved in the right way. What is an example of one of these laws that is bent towards loving neighbor? Don't steal. If your neighbor has something, don't take it. Which is a funny thing for the people who read Acts and they say, oh, Christianity is communist. We all share everything. A commandment like, do not steal what your neighbor has, is a really interesting commandment to have in a society like that, where everything is everyone's. Great, so love God, love neighbor. And then some people have separated it into these three categories, sort of beyond that, where you have you heard this, the moral law, the civil law, the ceremonial law? And this can be a really helpful way to look at it. It's not always the most feasible in the sense of if you're reading through Leviticus and trying to determine, is this one civil or ceremonial? Can someone explain to me what is a moral law? Yes.
The moral law are those laws which directly reflect the character of God. The Westminster Shorter Catechism say that they're they're summarily comprised in the Ten Commandments. So we call the Ten Commandments the moral law.
That's good. So the moral law is almost like what should you do? What is the right thing to do in a specific situation? Don't steal from your neighbor. Don't kill someone. Great. And this is mainly what's in the Ten Commandments, which we just read. There's also these civil laws, which is maybe how we think about the justice system happening here. When people go to court for civil disputes, it's like when your ox tramples the crops of your fourth cousin, and your fourth cousin now has no food because your ox trampled it, but the ox was known to trample and you didn't stop it, but it was technically an accident, but you could have prevented it. What do you do? And so, whereas the moral is like, how should you live in the first place? The civil is almost considering the fact that things go wrong, what do you do in response to set wrong things right? And then you have this ceremonial law, which you kind of see in Leviticus. Oh, the law is a tough subject. In Leviticus, you see a lot of ceremonial laws we talked about this sort of separation between a holy God and an unholy people. And so you see a ceremonial law, which is almost, how should an unholy people go about dwelling with a holy God? What sort of sacrifices need to be made? How should they be made? What sort of foods should they stay away from? Because it's clean foods and unclean foods. And it sort of deals with that realm. And this can be a little dicey once you get into the nitty-gritty of, is this law technically moral or is this law technically civil? Because then you have people today who say like, oh, ceremonial law, don't have to keep that anymore. Civil law, don't have to keep that anymore. Moral law, that's what we have to keep these days. But it gets kind of hard to draw the line between what is moral and what is in these other categories. But it can be helpful in the grand scheme of things to think about what is in the law, these three concepts. How does an unholy people dwell with a holy God? How do we settle disputes? And how do we go about living in the first place? And one thing that I feel like we don't think about very often is these sort of two directions for each law. For instance, you have do not murder. Are you keeping the commandment do not murder if you lay in your bed all day doing nothing and not seeing anyone ever? Is that keeping the law? What do you think? I see a nod.
By word but not by spirit?
By word but not by spirit. So I guess technically you could say, well, I didn't kill anyone. And that's fine and dandy, but the law isn't just concerned with what you shouldn't do. When God says, thou shalt not kill, he doesn't just mean don't kill anybody and that's it. That's all you have to do. What he's saying is you should care for the lives of the people around you. And this might be hard to see at first, but if you even look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he says things like, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. And even today, some people are saying, Jesus is changing the law. Look, he makes it say whatever he wants to. People are saying that even today. But you see, Jesus isn't merely concerned with don't kill someone, but he's concerned with care for the lives of the people around you. Don't let your anger stir up inside of you. Love your neighbor. He does the same thing with adultery. You've heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, whoever looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart. So he's not merely concerned with this like outward restraint of physical action, but he's concerned with a promotion of goodness inside of us that doesn't just care about not killing, but cares about life, that doesn't just care about not lying, but cares about truth. And I would say this might be one of the biggest differences between the law that God gives and the law even of the United States, where you have a speed limit, and the speed limit is set up, and if all you do for the rest of your life is drive the speed limit, then you're keeping the speed limit law. You're never breaking the speed limit. But what if the speed limit served to cultivate in us not just maintaining a certain speed, but a safety, which is probably what they're set up to do in the first place, is to develop a care of peace in the land sort of thing. But when you look at God's law and you see things like, thou shalt not covet, like, there's no law in the United States about this inward feeling of even jealousy. You're not breaking the United States law if you are jealous that someone has something that you don't. And so God cares a lot more than just actions in his law, but he cares about being. And he doesn't just care about setting up a list of rules that we don't do, but he cares about the things that we do. One thing I want to point out, I should start going faster here, but how does this law, even just the 10 Commandments, how does that compare to the Israelites' time in Egypt? What do you think?
What do you mean?
That's a good question. So, when the Israelites come out, God says, even, thou shalt not kill. What was the Egyptian law like in that sense?
Well, one of the first things we see is an Egyptian killing Israelite slave.
Right. So, in Egypt, Pharaoh makes this law that's kill all of the Hebrew boys. Oh, yeah. But you see, murder. And you see, Egyptianly lawful murder, Egyptianly lawful infanticide. What about even, what is it? There are slavery laws. Laws about how to take care of your slaves, when you should let your slaves go. And this is a hot button issue, because even today when I get on YouTube, it's full of Christianity is wrong because there's laws about keeping slaves. But this law is given after God has just rescued the Israelites from slavery. He's not a God who condones slavery and enslaving people, but when you look at his law, you'll see a God who cares for the slaves. Not like the law in Egypt, where at the drop of a hat, Pharaoh can say, burden them more. Make them make the bricks without the straw. Make them go find their own straw, because I hate them. So they don't get too strong. In God's law, you see that God cares for the lowly. He sets up these Sabbath years, opening of the ear. You see a God who's not concerned that his people have slaves. He's concerned with, if you have slaves, here's how you take care of them well. Here's how you don't be like Pharaoh. You even have this law that if a slave runs away from his master and he runs to you, you can't take him back. That's a law in there. If you find a runaway slave, he's free. Dr. Reed likes that one. That's a good one. But as we read these laws, you start to see again, we've said it over before, God is not like Pharaoh. And even here you see God's law is not like Pharaoh's law. God's law is not this burden that is laid on top of these people. Even if people turn it into that, especially in the New Testament, where they say you must keep this law to be saved. That's why the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council happened, was because people were going around saying, you must keep the law to be saved. And, oh man, but God's law is not meant to be this burden on his people, but it's meant to be a blessing on his people who are just coming out of slavery and oppression and under the horrible laws of Pharaoh. This is meant to be even a sort of freedom for them. But it's so easy to twist. And so for us, what is our relationship like to the law today? And the first thing I want to look at is in Matthew 5, where Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And in that sense, where we're standing, the law has been fulfilled. And so what does that mean for us? We might say that it's been fulfilled in the sense of Christ fulfilled the law through his obedience. Christ fulfilled the law in the sense that he kept the law. We might also say that Christ fulfilled the law in prophecy. He says to the Pharisees, it's like, haven't you read? The law is about me. So when you read the law, it's hard not to think of the way that it's pointing towards Christ, who cares for the lowly, who is our great high priest, as Hebrews says, who offers himself as a sacrifice. You see civil and ceremonial and moral fulfillment all pointing towards Christ. You see it fulfilled in his death. There are these laws about sin offerings and scapegoats and the sort of sin of the people being taken from the people and put into this thing or atoned for by the blood in this way. And Hebrews tells us Christ has fulfilled the law in the sense of he has offered himself as a once-for-all sacrifice. But fulfillment does not mean that the law has been done away with. The law isn't gone. And you see this where the Pharisees are saying, you shall not kill, you shall circumcise, you shall do this and this and this. We almost think of the law as bad and then Jesus is good. We get to Jesus, we don't have the law anymore. But then what sorts of things does Jesus say? He says, you have heard, do not murder. I say, don't even be angry. Like, you've heard this. I say, don't even this. You've heard, don't commit adultery. I say, don't even look at a woman with lustful intent. Jesus doesn't do away with the law, but he says, you've sort of already done away with the law by interpreting it as this tiny little rule that you have to keep. He says the law is a lot bigger than that. That being said, once we get to Paul and he starts dealing with these people who are twisting the law in this way of saying you have to do this and you have to do that to be saved, you have to keep this law, you have Paul sort of confronting that and saying that's not what the law is for. He says we are dead to the law. At the same time, he says, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? We're saved by faith. Do we then overthrow the law? And what's he say? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. That's Romans 3. In Romans 6, he says, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching which you were committed. So he's saying, even though in a sense you've been freed from this curse of the law, this trying to use the law for the sake of your salvation, even though you've been freed from that not unto the law is gone, doesn't matter anymore, but you've been freed from that unto obedience to the teaching which you were once accustomed. Even in Ezekiel, as Ezekiel prophesies of this future redemption that comes in Christ, this is God talking. He says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. So there's not this concern of we're now freed from the law, we can do whatever we want to, but we've been freed from the law so that we can actually obey it, so that we can actually be obedient to God. And that being said, that certain parts of the law have been fulfilled. We no longer need to bring a goat to church to offer sacrifice so that we can be at church, because Christ has offered this once for all sacrifice. He has fulfilled it. We no longer have to do that. There's certain condemnations that we don't have anymore. Whereas in the law, people can be stoned for murder. Now, in a sense, someone has been stoned for the murders that a believer has committed. Justice has not gone away, but it has been served already. And so how do we use the law today in light of these things? And there's, in the Reformed world, maybe beyond it, there are these three uses of the law that people talk about. And the first is this mirror. The law reveals to us our sin. If we didn't have a law, it would be really hard to figure out what we do that God doesn't like, what we do that isn't good. It would be a lot harder. And so having the law, we know, hey, this is a sin. I might not have known this was a sin, but I had the law. In another sense, the law is a mote. I chose all M words. In the sense of it is a restraint. When you come to a moat, it's like makes it a lot harder for you to get to a castle. So it is a sort of restraint. In one sense, you see a law, whether you actually care about the goodness of murdering or not, God does care about that, but if you see the consequences that murder elicits, those consequences might influence you to not do such a thing. And we have these even today in the United States law. If I know that me going 67 and a 65 could end up with me having to pay a bunch of money, whether I care about speeding or not, I'm probably not going to speed. Maybe sometimes. But the consequences lead to restraint. And then finally, and this is sort of the one that the Reformed world is known for, is the magistrate, this teacher, that the law is not only a restraint, not only teaches us our sin. These can be thought of in sort of a negative way of the law is kind of only serving to increase our burden of knowledge of sin, to increase our burden of what we can do and can't do. But the law is this teacher that teaches us how we should live. It teaches us the sorts of things that God cares about and the sorts of things which are good and not good to do. At the same time today, the law is given in a much different scenario than the Israelites at Sinai. Whereas there we saw separation between God and his people. We saw him setting up these priests to sort of keep us away, so that down here we are trying to do the law, up here God is holy. We have a new and better mediator. Let me read to you Hebrews 10. What time is it? 9:52. We'll end here. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. The law is not this bad thing that we should run away from. The psalmist says that the law is more to be desired is God's law than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey, drippings of the honeycomb. The law is sweet. And so today, when we gather for worship at St. Paul's, when we even kneel for confession, remember God's law. Maybe even walk through the 10 Commandments and let it be a measure for you of where have I transgressed those things that God cares about. Not just where have I committed murder, where have I lied, where have I stolen, but where have I left things undone? Where have I not cared for life? Where have I not cared for the poor and the lowly? Let the law reveal to you the depths of the wickedness of your sin. But once we have confessed and once we get to the assurance of pardon part, also remember the law then. And as you reflect on the depths of the law, let it reveal to you the depths of Christ's obedience on your behalf. As you think about how hard it is to keep the law, how we constantly seem to come up short, remember that Christ kept the law perfectly, the lengths that he went to, even to sacrifice himself, to live his life on behalf of you, and to die the death that we deserved. I'll go ahead and pray. God, we thank you for your law. We thank you for giving it even to us. God, we thank you that we don't have to keep it to be saved or to be made right with you, but God, that you sent Christ, that you came and you kept the law on our behalf. God, I pray that this would not lead us to abandon the law and to let sin abound, that grace may abound all the more. But God, I pray that you would build in us a hatred of sin and a love of life. God, I pray that you would teach us more and more as the day draws near to love you well, and to love our neighbors in the same way that you have loved us. And it's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. Thanks for having me.
Not like I chose, but
Yeah, that's true.
happy to have you anyway.
Thanks.